My parents left a voicemail saying, "You are out. Do not come back. We are moving on without you." I texted back, "Okay." So I moved on first. Trust locked. House deal cancelled. By the next morning, there were 62 missed calls and a message from their lawyer that read, "We have a serious problem." I laughed loudly and replied, "See you at 2." My name is Naomi, 32 years old and a senior financial analyst specializing in mergers and acquisitions at a top-tier hedge fund in Manhattan. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and treated your success as their personal bank account. The biting wind of Aspen whipped across my face as I stood alone outside the airport terminal. The snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets piling up on the concrete, while the smell of aviation fuel mixed with the crisp mountain air. I had just walked out of the luxury resort where my family had demanded we spend the Thanksgiving holiday. I was the one who had just stood at the mahogany front desk, sliding my personal black credit card to clear a $4,500 balance. That bill was heavily padded with my mother Patricia buying unnecessary spa packages, and my 28-year-old sister Serena ordering $1,000 bottles of champagne to her room. Serena is an influencer who spends her days curating a fake lifestyle on social media while living entirely off the family dime. I watched the taillights of the massive rented SUV fade into the snowy distance. Inside that vehicle sat my father Harrison, my mother Patricia, my sister Serena, and her husband Jamal. Jamal is an African-American man who confidently calls himself a tech chief executive officer. He runs a startup in Silicon Valley that produces absolutely nothing of value. Anyone with basic financial literacy can see he is just burning through angel investor cash to fund his designer wardrobe and leased sports cars. Yet my family treats him like royalty while they view my demanding corporate career as nothing more than glorified secretarial work. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders and checked my phone. The screen lit up with a new voicemail notification from my mother. I pressed play and held the cold device to my ear. Patricia spoke with that familiar artificial sweetness she always used when doing something incredibly cruel. She said, "Naomi, we left with Serena and Jamal. The SUV simply does not have enough room for your luggage. Serena bought too many things at the boutiques, and her comfort comes first since she has such a large social media following to maintain. Take an Uber to another airport or find your own way back to New York. Do not come back to the hotel. We are moving on without you. It is time you learned to stop ruining our family trips with your cold corporate attitude." I stood completely still listening to the background noise of the voicemail. I could hear Serena laughing about a new handbag and Jamal making a snide comment about how I probably needed to get back to my cubicle anyway. There was a time when this level of callous abandonment would have brought me to tears. There was a time when I would have scrambled to call them back begging for an explanation or offering to pay for a larger vehicle just to be included. But standing in the freezing snow of Colorado, something inside my chest finally shifted into absolute ice. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a heavy ache in my throat. Instead, I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. I opened my messaging app, typed the word "okay" and hit send. I turned my back on the snow and walked calmly into the heated airport terminal, finding a quiet table at a corner coffee shop. I ordered a black coffee, sitting down and opening my laptop. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow was supposed to be the biggest day of my sister's life. Harrison and Jamal were scheduled to sign an escrow agreement to purchase a $4.5 million mega mansion in the Hamptons. It was going to be the ultimate backdrop for Serena to film her empty lifestyle content and for Jamal to host his fake tech networking parties. They were purchasing this property using the primary funding source of our family trust. For years, Harrison had acted as the patriarch, making loud declarations at dinner parties about how he managed the family wealth. But Harrison was a fraud. He had never managed anything successfully. He lived off inherited money and projected a facade of old wealth. What my family did not know, what they had been too arrogant to ever investigate, was a secret my late grandmother had entrusted to me nearly a decade ago. My grandmother had seen right through Harrison and his financial incompetence. She knew he would drain the family resources to fund his superficial lifestyle. Before she passed away, she quietly, legally restructured the trust. She established a clause designating me as the sole trustee, the absolute legal authority over every single asset, the moment I turned 30 years old. I had reached that milestone 2 years ago. I had intentionally kept this power hidden, allowing Harrison to continue playing the big boss, while I quietly monitored the accounts, making sure they did not completely bankrupt the estate. I had watched the cash flow. I had gathered the data. I had waited for the moment they crossed the line of no return. Leaving me stranded at an airport after forcing me to pay their exorbitant vacation bill was that line. I logged into the secure offshore banking portal, utilizing my highest security clearance. The screen loaded, displaying the massive pending wire transfer for the Hamptons property. $200,000 in earnest money had already been deposited, sitting in limbo awaiting final authorization to clear the escrow process. I navigated to the transaction controls. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a fraction of a second before I firmly pressed cancel. A green confirmation box appeared verifying the termination of the real estate transaction, but I was not finished. I clicked over to the main dashboard of the family trust. I located the commercial credit lines that Jamal had been illegally using to prop up his failing software company. He had been quietly leveraging family assets as collateral to secure bridge loans, keeping his fraudulent business afloat. I systematically checked the boxes next to every single credit line, every revolving account, and every liquid asset pool. I selected the administrative override option and executed a total asset freeze. The banking interface refreshed, and the word locked appeared across the screen in bold red letters. Every financial pipeline my family relied upon was now dead. I closed my laptop, slid it into my leather briefcase, and finished my coffee. Using the massive amount of travel points I had accumulated from years of business trips, I booked myself a first-class ticket on the next direct flight back to New York. While my family spent the next 12 hours crammed into a rented car dealing with highway traffic, I drank vintage champagne at 30,000 feet, anticipating the beautiful chaos that Monday morning would bring. The Monday morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my office in Manhattan, overlooking the bustling streets of the financial district. I sat behind my desk reviewing a merger portfolio for a client, taking a slow, measured sip of my espresso. The atmosphere around me was a symphony of ringing phones and rapid keyboard typing. My personal phone, however, was providing its own frantic soundtrack. It had been vibrating relentlessly since 8 in the morning. I finally picked it up to check the notifications. There were exactly 62 missed calls. My text message inbox was an absolute war zone of escalating panic. Harrison had sent 15 messages ranging from aggressive demands to confused bargaining. He wrote, "Why is the bank rejecting my signature? Call the branch manager immediately and fix this. Did you touch the accounts? Answer your phone right now." Patricia had flooded my phone with emotional manipulation. She wrote, "Serena is crying hysterically in the real estate office. The sellers are threatening to walk away. Where are you? You need to fix whatever glitch is happening with the bank." Serena's messages were pure, unfiltered entitlement. She wrote, "My entire Hamptons house tour video is ruined. You need to wire the money from your personal account if the trust is down. Do not do this to me today of all days." Then there were the messages from Jamal. His usual arrogant swagger was completely gone, replaced by the frantic tone of a man whose house of cards was collapsing. He wrote, "The bank just froze my corporate credit cards. My payroll bounced. I cannot pay my developers today. Whatever corporate trick you pulled, you better undo it before I call your boss and get you fired." I smiled at the sheer audacity of his threat. He honestly believed a failing startup founder held any power over a senior merger analyst. I ignored all their messages and opened my email inbox. Right at the top, marked with high priority, was an urgent message from Mitchell, the senior attorney who handled the legal framework of the family trust. Mitchell was an old-school lawyer who had always patronized me, treating me like a little girl rather than a seasoned financial expert. His email read, "Naomi, we have a catastrophic situation. The Hamptons real estate contract has been formally canceled by the banking institution. Because the cancellation occurred after the contingency period, the sellers are keeping the $200,000 non-refundable deposit. Furthermore, the entire family trust has been frozen at the highest administrative level. Harrison is sitting in my office threatening to sue my firm for breach of duty. Jamal is facing a severe liquidity crisis and claiming the trust owes his company capital. We have a serious problem. You need to answer your phone and come down to the office immediately to resolve this administrative error." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, feeling an incredible, profound sense of peace. There was no administrative error. There was only a daughter who had finally decided to stop funding the people who treated her like an inconvenience. The $200,000 lost in the deposit was money Harrison had borrowed from personal friends, bridging a gap he could not afford. The collapse of Jamal's credit lines meant his fake company would be insolvent by the end of the week. Serena would have to return to her cramped apartment and face her followers without a shiny new mansion to show off. Patricia would have to explain to her high society friends why the family was suddenly experiencing a severe cash flow issue. I set my coffee mug down on the glass desk. I opened a new reply window to Mitchell's frantic email. I kept my response exceptionally brief, devoid of any emotion or panic. I typed, "There is no problem on my end, Mitchell. The trust is operating exactly as the sole trustee has mandated. Tell Harrison and Jamal to take a breath. I will see you all at your office at 2:00 sharp." I hit send, folded my hands together, and looked out over the skyline of New York. They had told me they were moving on without me. I was simply making sure they understood exactly what moving on without my money actually looked like. The glass doors of Mitchell's law firm slid open exactly at 2:00. The receptionist did not even have time to announce my arrival before the muffled sounds of shouting seeped through the heavy oak doors of the main conference room. I handed my coat to the assistant, smoothed my tailored blazer, and pushed the door open. The scene inside was exactly the pathetic spectacle I had anticipated. Harrison was pacing the length of the room, his face an unnatural shade of crimson. Patricia sat clutching a designer tissue, dabbing at dry eyes, while Serena leaned against the mahogany table, furiously texting on her phone. Jamal, my African-American brother-in-law, stood by the window, adjusting the cuffs of his overly expensive suit, trying to maintain an air of tech executive authority despite the visible sweat on his forehead. The moment the heavy door clicked shut behind me, the room erupted. Harrison slammed his fist down on the polished wood surface so hard his luxury watch rattled. He shouted, demanding to know what the hell I had done to the banking portal. He yelled that the escrow for the Hamptons property was completely voided, and the sellers were threatening to keep the $200,000 deposit. He paced closer, pointing a shaking finger at my face. He said my daughter and her husband need that house to establish a Silicon Valley caliber headquarters on the East Coast. He said Serena needs that property to secure her new brand deals. You have humiliated this family in front of top-tier real estate brokers. I stood there, letting his rage wash over me without blinking. I did not flinch. Patricia immediately joined the assault, her voice reaching a shrill pitch. She accused me of being a bitter, spiteful woman. She said just because we refused to pay for your master's degree at Columbia years ago does not give you the right to destroy your sister's happiness. She claimed I was jealous because Serena had a perfect marriage and a beautiful life, while I was just a 32-year-old single woman rotting in a corporate cubicle. She demanded I fix the computer glitch immediately, or she would personally see to it that I was disowned. Serena looked up from her phone, her face contorted with pure entitlement. She said, "My followers are expecting a house tour next week, Naomi. I already posted teasers about the infinity pool. You need to call the bank right now and authorize the wire transfer. You are ruining my life." Jamal sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. He said you financial analysts think you run the world because you push numbers around a spreadsheet. You do not understand how real business works. I have venture capitalists flying in next month, and I promised them a retreat at that Hamptons estate. Fix the damn account before you cost me millions. The sheer audacity of their demands was breathtaking. They had absolutely no concept of how money actually worked. They only knew how to spend it. They had spent my entire life draining our family resources, treating me like a burdensome afterthought, while treating Serena and Jamal like royalty. They expected me to panic. They expected me to scramble to the phone, apologize for my insubordination, and beg the bank to release the funds. Instead, I walked calmly to the leather chair at the head of the table. I pulled it out, sat down, and casually crossed my legs. I opened my leather briefcase with deliberate slowness. I pulled out a single sheet of paper, a certified bank statement showing the frozen accounts, and tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table. It glided across the polished surface, stopping right in front of Harrison. I looked at him, my expression entirely devoid of emotion. I said, "There is no glitch." I canceled the escrow. I froze the trust. I cut off the credit lines. You are out of money. Harrison stared at the document, his eyes darting frantically over the red, frozen status stamps printed across the page. He slammed his hand on the table again, screaming that I had committed a federal crime. He shouted that he was the patriarch of the family, the manager of the trust, and that he was going to have me arrested for cyber fraud. He looked at Mitchell, the lawyer, who had been sitting quietly in the corner of the room observing the entire exchange. Harrison demanded that Mitchell call the authorities immediately. Mitchell adjusted his glasses and looked down at his legal pad. He cleared his throat and said, "Harrison, I cannot do that. Naomi has not committed any crime. In fact, she is the only person in this room operating within her absolute legal rights." The silence that fell over the conference room was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that occurs right before a massive structural collapse. Patricia stopped dabbing her eyes. Serena lowered her phone. Jamal uncrossed his arms. Harrison looked at the lawyer as if the man had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. He demanded to know what Mitchell meant. I did not wait for the lawyer to explain. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I told them the truth they had been too arrogant to discover for themselves. I said 10 years ago, right before grandmother died, she realized exactly what kind of man you are, Harrison. She knew you were a financial parasite. She knew you would drain every single asset she spent a lifetime building just to fund your country club memberships and Patricia's country club lunches. She knew you would eventually bankrupt this family to pamper Serena. Patricia shrieked, saying that was a lie. She claimed grandmother loved them and trusted Harrison implicitly. She screamed that I had forged the documents. I ignored her outburst and kept my eyes locked on my father. I explained that grandmother had gone to Mitchell and restructured the entire legal framework of the family trust. She stripped you of all actual authority. You were never the primary beneficiary, and you certainly were not the manager. You were a temporary figurehead. She instituted a strictly confidential clause. The day I turned 30 years old, full and absolute control of the trust transferred entirely to me. I became the sole trustee. Every dollar, every property, every investment portfolio belongs to my legal discretion. I have the ultimate fiduciary authority to distribute or withhold funds as I see fit. Harrison's face drained of all color. He looked at Mitchell, seeking a denial. Mitchell simply nodded and opened a thick, bound folder. The lawyer confirmed that the trust transition had occurred exactly 2 years ago on my 30th birthday. He stated that Naomi had graciously allowed the family to continue receiving their monthly allowances and approved their expenditures out of her own goodwill. She had been monitoring the cash flow, silently acting as the shadow manager, while Harrison falsely believed he was in charge. I watched the reality hit them. The realization that they had spent the last 2 years mocking me, belittling my career, and treating me like garbage, all while I was secretly the only reason their credit cards did not decline. I told them I let you play boss, Harrison, because I wanted to see if you possessed even a shred of financial responsibility. But then you tried to pull $4.5 million for a vanity property while simultaneously forcing me to pay your Aspen hotel bills and abandoning me at an airport in a blizzard. You proved you are a liability, so I exercised my legal right as the sole trustee. I cut you off. You will not get the Hamptons house. You will not get your monthly stipends. You are completely, entirely cut off. The reality of their financial ruin settled over the room like a physical weight. Patricia began to hyperventilate, clutching her designer pearls. Serena stared at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, her influencer facade completely shattered. She shrieked that I was a monster, that I had planned this to ruin her life because no man would ever love me. But it was Jamal who escalated the situation. He stepped away from the window, his tall, imposing frame tense with desperate rage. He walked directly toward me, slamming his hands down on the table and leaning into my personal space. His arrogant demeanor flared up a defense mechanism against his impending failure. He looked down at me and said, "You think you hold all the cards because of some outdated family trust document. You are nothing but a corporate drone, Naomi. You sit in a cubicle and take orders. I am the chief executive officer of a tech startup. I have real power in the real world." He pointed a finger inches from my face. He threatened to destroy me professionally. He said, "I know exactly which hedge fund you work for. I know your boss's name. I have investors in my network who play golf with your managing directors. If you do not unfreeze my corporate credit lines right this second, I'm going to call your firm. I'm going to tell them you are an unstable, vindictive employee engaged in financial abuse and extortion. I will drag your name through the mud until you are fired and blacklisted from every financial institution on Wall Street. You will lose your precious little career by the end of the day." I did not shrink back. I did not break eye contact. I let him finish his pathetic little threat. I let the silence hang in the air, allowing his aggressive words to ring hollow. Then I smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that made Jamal hesitate. I said, "You really should do your research before you threaten a senior financial analyst, Jamal. You talk about your tech startup as if it is the next big thing in Silicon Valley. But I read your quarterly reports. I saw your cash burn rate. Your company produces absolutely zero revenue. You have been using the family trust as collateral to take out predatory bridge loans just to make payroll and lease your sports cars. You are drowning in debt, and your angel investors pulled out 3 months ago." Jamal's eyes widened. He demanded to know how I had access to his confidential corporate financials. I stood up slowly, buttoning my blazer. I said, "I know your financials because my firm specializes in acquiring distressed debt. When I saw you leveraging our family assets to secure those toxic bridge loans, I decided to protect my grandmother's legacy. I did not just freeze the trust, Jamal. I took my morning to execute a very specific corporate acquisition. My hedge fund bought your debt. I personally oversaw the transaction. We purchased the $3 million in bridge loans you defaulted on last Friday." I walked around the table, closing the distance between us until I was standing right in front of him. I lowered my voice, ensuring every single syllable landed with devastating precision. I said, "I do not work for you, Jamal. You work for me. I am not just the sole trustee of this family. I am your biggest creditor. And since you violated the terms of your loan agreement by failing to secure the Hamptons property as collateral, the debt is callable immediately. If you try to call my boss to get me fired, I will initiate a hostile takeover of your worthless company, seize your intellectual property, and liquidate your assets before dinner time." Jamal's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogant tech executive crumbled right before my eyes. The phone he had been gripping so tightly slipped from his hand and clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. He stumbled backward, collapsing into an empty chair, his breathing shallow and erratic. He finally understood the magnitude of his mistake. He had tried to bully the woman who held the absolute power to destroy his entire existence. I looked at the four of them, broken, silent, and utterly powerless. I grabbed my briefcase, turned toward the heavy oak doors, and prepared to leave them in the ruins of their own making. She stared at her husband's pathetic, crumpled form, and then her gaze snapped to me. The panic in her eyes twisted into a venomous, frantic hatred. She snatched her designer handbag off the table, grabbing her phone with shaking hands. She screamed that I would pay for this. She yelled that I was a psychopath and that she would make sure the entire world knew exactly what I had done to our family. She spun around, her heels clicking violently against the hardwood floor, and stormed out of the conference room, leaving her parents and her ruined husband behind. I did not care. I calmly packed my documents into my briefcase, thanked Mitchell for his time, and walked out into the crisp Manhattan afternoon. For the first few hours, the silence was blissful. I returned to my office at the hedge fund, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and began processing the final paperwork for Jamal's defaulted bridge loans. I felt a profound sense of peace. Then my desk phone rang. Then my personal cell phone vibrated. Then my corporate email inbox began pinging with a relentless, deafening rhythm. My assistant rushed into my office, her eyes wide, handing me her tablet. She said I needed to see this immediately. On the screen was Serena's face. She was sitting in the front seat of her luxury SUV, the camera angled perfectly to catch the artificial tears streaming down her carefully contoured cheeks. She had activated her full influencer persona, weaponizing her 3 million followers. The bold text plastered across the video read, "My psychopathic sister stole my life." Serena wept into the camera, her voice breaking with manufactured trauma. She sobbed, telling her audience a completely fabricated story about how her cruel, jealous older sister had manipulated our elderly grandmother on her deathbed. She claimed I had forged legal documents to steal the family trust, leaving our aging parents destitute and heartbroken. She wiped her eyes, looking directly into the lens, and cried that I was not stopping there. She told her followers that I was using my position at a corrupt Wall Street hedge fund to illegally seize her husband's innocent tech startup. She sobbed that I was making them homeless, that I was freezing their bank accounts out of pure vindictive spite because I was a miserable spinster who hated seeing anyone else happy. She begged her followers to help her get justice. She did not just post the video, she tagged my full name. She tagged my company. She posted a direct link to my LinkedIn profile. The video was a masterclass in digital manipulation, and it caught the social media algorithm like wildfire. By the time I was watching it, the post already had 2 million views and hundreds of thousands of shares. The internet mob had mobilized with terrifying speed. People who had absolutely no idea how generational family trusts or corporate debt acquisitions worked were suddenly legal experts crying out for my head. My LinkedIn notifications were a cascading waterfall of pure hatred. Strangers were flooding my professional profile, calling me a monster, a thief, and a corporate parasite. They left thousands of comments demanding my immediate termination. They claimed I was the absolute epitome of Wall Street greed and corruption. But the digital mob did not stop with my personal accounts. Serena's followers organized a highly coordinated attack on my hedge fund. They flooded our corporate social media pages, leaving one-star reviews and aggressive comments on every single post. They began calling the main reception line, tying up the firm's communication network with angry demands that I be investigated for financial fraud and elder abuse. They threatened to dox our clients and boycott any business associated with our firm if I was not fired by the end of the day. My inbox filled with threatening emails from anonymous accounts promising to ruin my life the way they believed I had ruined Serena's. I watched the view count climb on the video, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Serena knew exactly what she was doing. She knew she had absolutely no legal standing to fight me in a courtroom, so she had dragged me into the court of public opinion, where facts did not matter, and blind emotion ruled everything. She was running a smear campaign designed to make me so radioactive that my firm would have no choice but to fire me, to cut their losses and distance themselves from a public relations nightmare. The harassment was scaling at an unprecedented rate. My desk phone lit up with another dozen calls from random area codes. I reached out and unplugged the cord from the wall, severing the connection. I sat back in my chair watching the hateful comments roll in on my monitor. Serena wanted to destroy my career, the one thing I had built entirely on my own without a single dime of our family's money. The heavy glass door to my office clicked open. It was not my assistant this time. It was Marcus, the managing director of the firm. He stood in the doorway holding his smartphone, his expression tight and unreadable. The chaotic noise of the trading floor behind him seemed to fade away. He stepped inside, closing the door firmly behind him, blocking out the ringing phones. He looked at me, taking a deep breath. He said, Human Resources is waiting for us in the executive boardroom, Naomi. The partners have seen the video, and the board is demanding answers right now. I stood up from my desk, smoothing the front of my skirt. I looked at Marcus. He was sweating. I was not. I picked up my legal pad and walked past him, leading the way out of my office. We walked down the long corridor lined with frosted glass. The trading floor to our left was usually a hive of orchestrated chaos, but today an unusual number of heads turned to watch me pass. The whispers were audible over the hum of the servers. They had all seen Serena's video. As we approached the main reception atrium, a space designed to intimidate clients with its soaring ceilings and imported Italian marble, a sudden high-pitched shriek shattered the professional atmosphere. I stopped dead in my tracks. Marcus bumped into my shoulder. Standing in the center of the reception area, fighting against the polite restraint of two bewildered security guards, was my mother. Patricia looked like a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality. Her designer silk scarf was askew. Her expensive blowout was tangled and wild. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She had somehow managed to bypass the ground floor lobby security, likely throwing a tantrum and tailgating a group of executives into the private elevator bank. When her wild eyes locked onto me across the marble floor, she let out another ear-piercing scream. She shoved one of the security guards aside with surprising force and charged toward me. "Give the money back to your brother right now!" Patricia shrieked, her voice echoing violently off the glass walls. "Give Jamal his company back. Are you trying to drive this family to death?" The entire floor went completely still. Senior partners froze halfway to the water cooler. Two high-net-worth clients waiting on the leather sofas lowered their financial prospectuses, staring in absolute shock. The receptionist had her hand hovering over the panic button. Patricia did not care about the audience. She had spent her entire life meticulously curating an image of high society elegance, and now she was throwing it all away in the middle of a Wall Street firm just to protect her fragile ego and her precious son-in-law. She stopped inches from my face, pointing a shaking manicured finger at my chest. "You are a monster, Naomi." Patricia screamed, spittle flying from her lips. "You saw Serena's video? The whole world knows what you are now. You are a thief. You stole your grandmother's money, and now you are trying to bankrupt Jamal. Unfreeze the trust accounts. Call off the debt acquisition. If you do not fix this right this second, I swear to God I will stand in this lobby and tell every single person who walks through those doors what a psychopathic, ungrateful daughter you are." Marcus stepped forward, raising his hands in a placating gesture, attempting to defuse the situation. He told Patricia she needed to lower her voice and leave the premises immediately. Patricia turned her wrath on him. She told him to shut his mouth. She yelled that he was employing a criminal and that if he did not fire me on the spot, she would personally sue the firm for aiding and abetting financial extortion. I put my hand on Marcus's arm, gently pulling him back. I stepped right into my mother's personal space, forcing her to look up at me. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I let the absolute silence of the room amplify my words. "Look around you, Patricia," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet pitch. "Look at where you are. This is not your country club dining room. This is a multi-billion-dollar financial institution. The men sitting on those sofas behind you manage sovereign wealth funds. The people standing in the hallways execute global mergers. And you are standing here screaming like a toddler throwing a tantrum in a toy aisle. You have spent your entire life pretending to be a woman of class and grace. Look at how pathetic you appear right now." Patricia gasped, her face flushing a deep crimson. She opened her mouth to scream again, but I cut her off. "You want to talk about the trust?" I continued, my gaze pinning her in place. "You want to talk about Jamal. Jamal took out predatory loans he could not pay. He used assets he did not own as collateral. He committed corporate fraud. I did not steal anything. I executed a perfectly legal distressed debt acquisition to save my grandmother's legacy from his incompetence. If you do not turn around and walk into that elevator right now, I will not just have security physically drag you out onto the street. I will call the police. I will press charges for trespassing and harassment. And then I will take the footage from the security cameras above us, and I will release it to every single one of your high society friends." The threat hit her like a bucket of ice water. Her eyes darted upward, spotting the black domes of the security cameras mounted on the ceiling. The realization of her public humiliation finally pierced through her hysteria. The two security guards stepped up beside her, their expressions hardening as they grabbed her arms. Patricia tried to yank herself free, but the guards held firm. As they marched her backward toward the elevator, she continued to thrash, her voice cracking as she sobbed. She yelled that I was dead to her. She screamed that I had destroyed the family and that I would die alone. The heavy steel doors of the elevator finally slid shut, cutting off her frantic wails. The silence in the reception area was deafening. I slowly smoothed my blazer, turning back to Marcus. His face was pale. He swallowed hard, adjusting his tie. I looked at the receptionist and calmly asked her to send an apology gift basket to the clients on the sofa. Then I looked at Marcus. I said, "You mentioned the board was waiting." Marcus simply nodded, unable to formulate a sentence. He turned on his heel and walked briskly down the corridor toward the executive suites. I followed him, my footsteps perfectly measured. We reached the end of the hallway, where two massive oak doors stood closed. Marcus pushed them open, and we stepped inside. The executive boardroom was vast, dominated by a long, polished table. The entire board of directors was seated, their faces grim and unreadable. At the head of the table stood Evelyn, the global director of human resources. A massive flat-screen television was mounted on the far wall. It was paused on Serena's tear-stained face, the viral video frozen right in the middle of her frantic accusations against me and the firm. Evelyn crossed her arms over her chest, staring at me with a mixture of anger and extreme corporate anxiety. She said, "Take a seat, Naomi. We just watched a madwoman assault our reception area, while our firm's name trends globally for financial extortion. You have exactly 5 minutes to explain this catastrophic public relations risk before we terminate your employment and have security escort you out of the building." I did not break eye contact with Evelyn. I did not offer the frantic, tearful apology she was clearly expecting. The men and women seated around the massive oak table were the titans of our firm. They managed billions of dollars in global assets, and they absolutely did not tolerate public relations liabilities. Their faces were carved from stone, waiting for my execution. Marcus hovered near the door, sweating profusely, clearly regretting ever bringing me into his division. I walked slowly past Evelyn, ignoring her outstretched hand that signaled me to sit. I moved directly to the multimedia console at the head of the boardroom table. I pulled my encrypted tablet from my briefcase, plugged in the display cable, and tapped the screen to sync with the massive monitor behind Evelyn. The paused image of my sister's crying face vanished instantly, replaced by a stark black and white financial spreadsheet. I turned to face the board of directors, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I said, "I will not apologize for the hysterical actions of my estranged family members. I will, however, explain exactly why that woman in the lobby was screaming and why my sister is currently performing a fabricated tragedy for her digital audience. More importantly, I will explain why this situation is not a liability for our firm, but rather a highly lucrative acquisition that I have personally secured." The murmurs around the table ceased immediately. A few of the senior partners leaned forward, adjusting their glasses. Evelyn lowered her arms, her scowl shifting into a look of deep suspicion. I tapped my screen, advancing to the first slide. The high-definition monitor displayed a side-by-side comparison. On the left was a screenshot of Serena's viral video, with her quote about being left homeless and destitute highlighted in yellow. On the right was a heavily annotated credit card statement. I pointed to the screen. I said, "My sister claims I am bankrupting her out of vindictive spite. Let us examine the empirical data." The statement on the right belongs to the primary account she shares with her husband. Over the past 48 hours, while supposedly facing imminent homelessness, she has charged over $80,000 in luxury goods. I tapped the screen again, highlighting the transactions line by line. $30,000 at a boutique jeweler in Soho. $15,000 on custom designer luggage. Another $20,000 on a non-refundable deposit for a private villa in St. Bart's. She is not crying because she is destitute. She is crying because I legally froze the family trust that she has been using as her personal piggy bank, and the credit card you see on the screen will be declined the next time she tries to swipe it. A low murmur rippled through the boardroom. A few of the partners exchanged glances. The narrative of the cruel corporate sister destroying the innocent influencer was beginning to crack under the weight of cold, hard numbers. But the real issue is not my sister's shopping addiction. I continued pacing slowly across the front of the room. The issue that concerns this firm is her husband's business. In her video, Serena claims I am using my Wall Street position to illegally seize an innocent tech startup. Let us look at how innocent that startup truly is. I swiped to the next slide. A complex cash flow diagram appeared on the screen, tracing millions of dollars through a web of limited liability companies and corporate holding accounts. The board members immediately recognized the structure. It was a classic shell game designed to hide the movement of capital. Jamal operates a company that claims to be developing revolutionary logistics software. I explained, my voice ringing with absolute authority in the quiet room. 6 months ago, he secured $3 million in angel investment funding based on fraudulent revenue projections. I have spent the last 4 weeks conducting a forensic analysis of his corporate accounts on my own time. The diagram you see behind me tracks exactly where that $3 million went. I tapped the screen again, isolating specific transaction pathways in bright red. I said, $0 went to research and development. $0 went to software engineering. Instead, Jamal funneled the angel investment capital through a dummy vendor account and directly into his personal lifestyle fund. The corporate retreats he expensed were actually first-class vacations to Dubai and Monaco for him and my sister. The fleet of company vehicles he leased for his non-existent sales team are in fact exotic sports cars registered to his personal address. He has been systematically embezzling investor capital to maintain a facade of extreme wealth. The atmosphere in this boardroom underwent a seismic shift. The anger and corporate anxiety that had filled the room just minutes prior evaporated completely. It was replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. These were men and women who made their living tearing apart weak companies, and they were now looking at a masterclass in financial dissection. The frowns of disapproval morphed into expressions of deep, calculating respect. Evelyn stepped aside, her eyes fixed on the cash flow diagram. Marcus had stopped sweating and was now staring at the screen with undisguised awe. When Jamal's angel investors realized they had been conned, they demanded their money back. I continued holding the room in the palm of my hand. Jamal panicked. He attempted to use my family's generational trust as collateral to take out predatory bridge loans to cover the embezzled funds and keep his company afloat. He assumed he could force the family to bail him out. He did not know that I had just legally assumed sole control of that trust. I blocked the transaction. His loans went into default last Friday. I brought up the final slide. It was the official acquisition contract bearing our firm's letterhead digitally signed and time-stamped from that morning. I did not illegally seize anything, I stated, looking directly at the managing partner at the far end of the table. I saw an opportunity. I legally purchased Jamal's defaulted debt for pennies on the dollar using our distressed asset fund. Because he committed gross financial fraud and violated every covenant of his loan agreement, the debt is callable immediately. We now own all of his intellectual property, his remaining corporate assets, and the personal collateral he foolishly tied to the company. I closed my tablet and placed it on the table. I looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every single board member. I said Serena is screaming on the internet because she is terrified. Patricia was screaming in the lobby because her source of endless wealth has been cut off. They want to frame this as an emotional family dispute to force us into backing down. But this is not family drama. This is a targeted, highly profitable acquisition of distressed assets. I turned a fraudulent startup into a massive gain for this firm before my lunch break. Now you can either fire me for causing a temporary social media inconvenience, or you can let me finish liquidating Jamal's assets and adding millions to our quarterly profit margins. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom remained closed, holding the tension inside. The silence stretched out, but this time it was not filled with judgment. It was filled with greedy admiration. The managing partner at the end of the table slowly leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. He looked at the cash flow diagram on the screen, and then he looked at me. A slow, shark-like smile spread across his weathered face. He did not look at Evelyn. He did not look at Marcus. He kept his eyes locked on me. He said, "I do not care what your sister posts on the internet, Naomi. You have 48 hours to strip that company down to the copper wiring and bring me the profits. Get back to work." I nodded at the managing partner, closed my encrypted tablet, and walked out of the executive boardroom without a single backward glance. Evelyn did not say a word. Marcus trailed behind me, his posture entirely transformed from anxious panic to profound deference. When I stepped back onto the main trading floor, the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. The digital mob that had been screaming for my termination just an hour ago meant absolutely nothing in this room anymore. Wall Street respects one thing above all else, and that is the ruthless execution of a profitable strategy. I had just delivered a masterclass. I returned to my office, plugged my phone back into the wall, and got to work. Over the next 72 hours, I executed the managing partner's orders with surgical precision. I did not just liquidate Jamal's company, I stripped it down to the studs. I invoked the immediate acceleration clauses on his defaulted bridge loans and seized every single corporate asset tied to his fraudulent enterprise. The 3 exotic sports cars he had leased under the guise of company vehicles were repossessed by Tuesday morning. I froze the corporate expense accounts, permanently cutting off the limitless supply of capital funding his and Serena's lavish lifestyle. I directed our legal team to cancel the commercial lease on his massive empty office space in Tribeca. By Wednesday evening, Jamal's revolutionary tech startup existed only as a cautionary tale in our firm's profit ledgers. The immediate financial strangulation had a predictable effect on my family. Serena went completely dark on social media. The daily vlogs of her unboxing designer bags and complaining about her psychopathic sister vanished. She could not post about being a victim while simultaneously trying to hide the fact that her black credit cards were being declined at high-end boutiques across Manhattan. But my father Harrison had never been a man who accepted defeat. He had spent his entire life dictating the terms of our family dynamic, demanding absolute compliance, and punishing anyone who dared to step out of line. He could not handle the reality that I, the daughter he had always marginalized, had completely outmaneuvered his chosen golden child and his favorite son-in-law. Desperation combined with a shattered ego is a highly volatile mixture. Thursday morning, a private courier bypassed the main reception and was escorted directly to my office. He placed a thick, heavy envelope on my glass desk, required my signature, and left without a word. The return address belonged to Vance & Associates, a law firm infamous in the financial district. Richard Vance was a notorious shark. He was a bottom-feeding litigator who specialized in high-profile corporate extortion, utilizing dirty tactics, media leaks, and frivolous lawsuits to bury his opponents in bad press until they agreed to a quiet, lucrative settlement. I broke the seal on the envelope and pulled out a stack of dense legal documents. It was a formal notice of intent to sue in federal court. Harrison and Jamal had officially joined forces, pooling whatever dwindling resources they had left to retain Vance. I read through the proposed charges, feeling a cold knot of realization settle in my chest. They were preparing to sue me for breach of fiduciary duty and tortious interference with lawful property. The narrative they were constructing was entirely fictional but highly dangerous in the hands of a lawyer like Vance. They alleged that I had exploited my grandmother's declining mental state to illegally seize control of the family trust. Furthermore, they claimed that I had used insider information from my hedge fund to artificially manipulate the debt markets, specifically targeting and destroying Jamal's legitimate business out of personal malice. It was a blatant lie designed to paint me as a corrupt corporate raider. But the most alarming part of the package was the cover letter written directly by Richard Vance. It was not a standard legal warning. It was a targeted extortion attempt. Vance outlined a brutal 24-hour ultimatum. He stated that his firm had compiled a comprehensive dossier containing alleged witness testimonies, financial discrepancies, and highly damaging personal allegations against me. He demanded that I immediately sign over control of the family trust back to Harrison and reverse the corporate acquisition of Jamal's company. The final paragraph delivered the true threat. Vance wrote that if I did not comply with their demands within 24 hours, he would release the entire unverified dossier to the Wall Street Journal, several major news networks, and the same social media platforms Serena had already agitated. They were threatening to launch a media firestorm so massive that it would force regulatory agencies to investigate my firm. They knew my board of directors tolerated bad PR only when it resulted in profit. A protracted federal investigation, however, would make me a permanent liability. Harrison and Jamal were betting my firm would fire me to avoid the scrutiny, leaving me financially ruined and vulnerable. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at the threatening ultimatum. My father was willing to destroy my career, ruin my reputation, and drag my name through the federal court system simply to protect a fraudster and maintain his absolute authority over the family. The betrayal was absolute. I picked up my desk phone and dialed my attorney. Mitchell answered on the second ring, his tone brisk and professional. I read the entire ultimatum to him word for word. I detailed the federal charges, the threat of the media leak, and the 24-hour deadline. Mitchell let out a heavy sigh over the line. He said, "Vance is a dangerous operator, Naomi. He thrives on collateral damage. He knows these charges are completely baseless, but he also knows the mere accusation of fiduciary fraud will trigger an SEC inquiry into your hedge fund. They are trying to back you into a corner. They want you to panic and settle before this goes public." I looked at the signature on the bottom of the threat. I did not feel panic. I felt a profound, icy clarity. I understood exactly what this maneuver represented. High-powered shark lawyers required massive retainers. Harrison and Jamal were bleeding cash. They did not have the capital to sustain a multi-year federal lawsuit. This ultimatum was their final desperate gamble. They were trying to win the war with a single terrifying bluff. "I do not negotiate with terrorists, Mitchell," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "And I certainly do not surrender to men who are drowning in their own incompetence." Mitchell asked how I wanted to proceed. He warned me that ignoring the deadline would guarantee a media leak by tomorrow morning. I smiled, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. I said, "I want you to call Richard Vance. Tell him we take his allegations very seriously. Tell him we want to avoid a public spectacle at all costs." Mitchell sounded deeply confused. He asked if I was actually suggesting we surrender the trust funds back to my father. I said, "Absolutely not. Tell Vance that we are willing to discuss a global settlement to resolve all outstanding family and corporate grievances. I want you to set up a formal mediation session for tomorrow afternoon. Bring them all to the table. Bring Harrison, bring Jamal, and bring Serena. Let them think they have won. Let them walk into a room believing they hold all the leverage. I am going to end this permanently." Vance's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered his composure. He chuckled, a dry, abrasive sound that echoed unpleasantly against the frosted glass walls of the conference room. He leaned over the mahogany table and tapped the thick stack of settlement papers with a manicured finger. He told me that corporate bravado would not save my career and that I was completely out of options. He pushed the silver fountain pen closer to my hand and demanded my signature immediately. I let the heavy silence stretch out, allowing the tension to suffocate the room. I slowly extended my right hand toward the center of the table. My fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy metal barrel of his expensive pen. A collective exhale swept through the opposing side of the table. The shift in their body language was immediate and nauseating. They actually believed they had broken me. I watched their postures transform from defensive aggression to absolute victorious arrogance. Jamal slumped back into his expensive leather chair, blowing out a long breath and wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. His chest puffed out, his bruised ego instantly inflating with the false reality that he had just conquered a Wall Street executive. Serena crossed her arms over her chest, lifting her chin, and looking down her nose at me with a gaze of pure, triumphant disdain. Harrison gave a sharp, definitive nod, functioning like a military general accepting the unconditional surrender of a rebellious and difficult soldier. They truly believed the threat of public ruin was my breaking point. They operated in a world where image, social standing, and public perception were the only currencies that mattered. They assumed I shared their fragile vanity. I pulled the thick stack of settlement documents toward me. I did not look at the final signature line where Vance had placed small yellow sticky notes to guide my capitulation. Instead, I deliberately turned back to the very first page. The crisp, sharp sound of heavy bond paper flipping filled the dead air of the room. I read the top page slowly. Then I turned it. I read the second page, tracing the lines of text with my eyes. I turned it again. Vance shifted his weight, adjusting his expensive tie, clearly annoyed by the delay. Mitchell sat perfectly still beside me, functioning as an impenetrable wall of legal support, trusting my silence entirely. I took my absolute time examining the ridiculous demands Richard Vance had typed out on his firm's premium letterhead. I read the clause demanding the total transfer of the generational family trust back to Harrison's sole control. I read the section outlining the immediate cessation of all debt collection and asset seizure against Jamal's fraudulent tech startup. I read the demand for the deed to the Hamptons coastal property. Finally, I stared at the paragraph demanding a $1 million extortion fee neatly disguised as an emotional distress and defamation payout for Serena. The quiet, rhythmic flipping of the pages was too much for my mother's notoriously fragile patience. Patricia leaned forward, resting her diamond-clad wrists heavily on the polished wood. She looked at me with a highly concentrated mixture of pity and utter revulsion. She could not resist the urge to kick me while she believed I was down. "See?" Patricia sneered, her voice dripping with toxic maternal superiority. "If you had just been obedient from the start, things would be fine. You always have to make everything so incredibly difficult, Naomi. You always have to push this family to the absolute brink just to get some twisted form of attention. You should be thanking your father on your knees for not pressing federal charges against you and sending you to prison. Just sign the papers and stop being such a stubborn, ungrateful brat." I stopped on the final page of the document. The blank signature line glared up at me, waiting for me to surrender my financial independence and my self-respect. I slowly raised my head from the paper and locked eyes with my mother. Looking at Patricia, I saw 30 years of systemic dismissiveness staring back at me. I saw every childhood birthday she had conveniently forgotten because she was busy organizing Serena's extravagant parties. I saw every academic achievement and career milestone she had minimized or completely ignored. I saw all the times she had shielded Serena and Jamal from the devastating consequences of their own disastrous choices, choosing to sacrifice my peace of mind to maintain their illusions. I picked up the silver fountain pen. I did not uncap it. I raised it slightly and tapped the heavy metal barrel against the solid mahogany table. The sharp metallic clack echoed through the room like a gunshot. I tapped it again, then a third time. The sudden rhythmic noise shattered their victorious atmosphere. Jamal sat up straight. Serena's smug smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Vance narrowed his eyes, his predatory instincts flaring as he realized the script was deviating from his plan. I calmly aligned the edges of their extortion document, making the thick stack of papers perfectly neat and uniform. I placed my hand flat on top of the pile and slid the entire contract directly back across the table, pushing it until it hit Richard Vance's leather briefcase. I set the silver pen down right next to it. I looked directly into Patricia's eyes, and my voice was completely flat, entirely devoid of the emotional hysteria she desperately craved. I said, "I am not signing anything." The atmosphere in the mediation room imploded. Serena bolted upright in her chair, slamming her palms flat against the table and shrieking my name. Jamal's jaw dropped open in stunned disbelief. Harrison's face flushed a dangerous shade of purple as he slammed his fist down, commanding me to pick the pen back up immediately. Richard Vance leaned over the table, his face twisting into an ugly threat, promising me that his contacts at the Wall Street Journal would publish his fabricated dossier in exactly 10 minutes, guaranteeing my permanent destruction. I completely ignored their screaming. I did not even blink. I calmly reached down into the large leather briefcase resting on the floor beside my chair. I bypassed my encrypted tablet and my standard corporate files. My fingers found the heavy, oversized envelope I had meticulously prepared for this exact confrontation. I pulled it out and dropped it onto the center of the mahogany table with a heavy, authoritative thud. It was a massive stack of legal documents bound tightly together with thick black clips. Glaring from the top right corner of the very first page, impossible for Vance or anyone else to miss, was the bright, unmistakable red seal of a federal investigator. The bright, unmistakable red seal of a federal investigator sat like a ticking bomb in the center of the mahogany table. Vance stared at the seal. The arrogant smirk melted off his face, instantly replaced by the sharp, calculating caution of a man who suddenly realizes he has stepped onto a landmine. His hand slowly retreated from the silver fountain pen. He did not say a single word. He knew exactly what that specific federal insignia represented. Harrison leaned forward, squinting at the thick stack of bound papers. His heavy gray eyebrows furrowed in deep confusion. He demanded to know what I was playing at. He asked if this was some sort of forged theatrical prop designed to scare them into backing down. I kept my hands folded neatly on my lap. I said you all walked into this room completely convinced that you understood the rules of the game. You thought this was a petty domestic dispute over control and inheritance. You thought I blocked your corporate transactions because I was carrying some childish grudge about that airport incident in Aspen. You thought I froze the generational family trust out of spite because Patricia threw a hysterical tantrum in my lobby. I let my gaze sweep slowly across their faces, taking in their arrogant posture before I dismantled it completely. I said you are entirely wrong. I did not freeze the family trust because my feelings were hurt. I froze the trust because 48 hours ago, I submitted this exact file, along with thousands of pages of unredacted financial records, directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS and the White Collar Crime Unit of the FBI. The color drained from my father's face so fast he looked as though he might physically collapse right there in his chair. Serena let out a sharp, breathless gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Jamal gripped the arms of his expensive leather seat, his knuckles turning stark white as his chest began to heave with sudden panicked breaths. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, claiming the physical space they were rapidly abandoning. I told them I spent the last 3 weeks mapping out every single transaction that moved through our generational accounts. I did not just find Jamal's missing $3 million of embezzled angel investment money. I found absolutely everything. I looked directly into my father's wide, terrified eyes. I said I found the offshore shell companies you set up in the Cayman Islands, Harrison. I found the deliberate misclassification of your domestic real estate profits designed to evade millions in capital gains taxes. You allowed Jamal to funnel his stolen startup capital into our family trust because you were using the exact same trust to launder your own illicit funds. You two were using our grandmother's legacy as a glorified washing machine for dirty money. You committed systemic wire fraud, and you left a digital paper trail a mile wide. Then I turned my attention to Serena. She was trembling violently, her perfectly applied makeup looking stark and garish against her chalk-white skin. I said, "And you, Serena, were the most reckless of all. You were expensing your entire life, your designer bags, your private jets, your luxury Hamptons rentals through the trust, claiming they were operational expenses for a fake charitable foundation. That is not just poor accounting, Serena. That is felony tax evasion. You are not going to get a Hamptons house out of this mediation. You are going to get a federal indictment." Jamal tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but only a dry, raspy sound came out. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically to the closed glass doors, as if calculating whether he could physically run out of the building. He finally managed to stammer that I was bluffing. He claimed I would never turn in my own family because I would be implicated in the exact same crimes. Mitchell let out a short, cynical laugh. He leaned into the microphone embedded in the table. He said my client is a fully protected federal whistleblower. She assumed legal control of the trust specifically to conduct an internal corporate audit, and she immediately reported the financial discrepancies to the appropriate authorities. She has secured blanket immunity from the Department of Justice. You, however, are facing decades in federal prison. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating sound of complete catastrophic ruin. They were no longer worrying about social media rumors or public relations optics. They were suddenly staring down the barrel of federal subpoenas, asset seizures, and mandatory minimum prison sentences. Richard Vance moved first. He was a bottom-feeding litigator, but he was not an idiot. He knew the difference between a frivolous civil shakedown and a federal criminal probe. He abruptly stood up and began stuffing his legal pads and settlement papers back into his oversized leather briefcase. His movements were frantic and panicked. Harrison looked up at his high-priced lawyer in absolute shock. He ordered Vance to sit down and handle this situation. He yelled that this was exactly what he was paying him for. Vance zipped his briefcase shut and took a massive step away from my family. He told Harrison that his retainer covered civil litigation and family disputes. He explicitly stated that his firm did not handle federal criminal defense, especially when the clients had actively concealed ongoing felonies during the discovery process. He looked at me, his expression completely stripped of its previous arrogance. He told me he formally withdrew the settlement offer and the threat of litigation. He practically ran toward the glass doors, desperate to distance his law firm from the radioactive blast zone my family had just become. I raised my voice slightly, stopping him with his hand on the heavy door handle. I told him he could run, but he had already put his official signature on an extortion demand designed to silence a protected federal whistleblower. I advised him to hire his own defense attorney because the FBI would be reviewing his involvement by tomorrow morning. Vance turned a sickening shade of gray, pushed the door open, and fled down the hallway. Now it was just family. Patricia began to cry. It was not her usual manipulative theatrical performance. These were genuine, panicked tears of utter despair. Her diamond necklaces clinked against the wood as she buried her face in her hands. She sobbed that she would lose her country club memberships. She cried that her high society friends would abandon her when the federal agents raided her house. Even in the face of federal prison, she only cared about her fragile social standing. Harrison seemed paralyzed. The fierce patriarch who had controlled our lives with an iron fist was instantly reduced to a hollow, broken shell. He looked at the red federal seal on the folder and then looked back at me. His voice shook as he asked me what I wanted. He begged me to call the FBI and tell them it was all a massive accounting mistake. He promised to give me whatever I asked for. He promised to step down from the family businesses entirely. I shook my head slowly, feeling a profound sense of closure wash over me. I told him, "You cannot retract a federal whistleblower report, Harrison. The wheels are already in motion. Warrants are being drawn up as we sit here. Your bank accounts are already locked by the government. Your assets are flagged for seizure. It is entirely out of my hands now." Jamal suddenly stood up, his chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his voice cracking with sheer terror and helpless rage. He accused me of destroying their lives. He asked how I could do this to my own flesh and blood. I stood up, smoothing my tailored jacket. I looked down at the 4 people who had tormented me, mocked me, and tried to extort me for my entire life. I told Jamal I did not destroy your lives. I simply handed the government the blueprints of the destruction you built yourselves. Jamal stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of his chair before he collapsed heavily into it. He tried to shake his head to formulate a coherent defensive sentence, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The arrogant swagger he had carried into the mediation room had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the trembling physical shell of a man who realized his entire existence was about to be dismantled. I placed my hands flat on the mahogany table, leaning forward to ensure he absorbed every single syllable. I told him, "You really thought you were a genius, Jamal. You thought you could easily outsmart seasoned Wall Street investors with a few fabricated spreadsheets and a charming smile. But you did not just lie on your initial pitch decks to secure capital. When your seed money dried up and your investors started demanding their quarterly performance reports, you went into an absolute panic." I watched his chest heave with shallow, erratic breaths. I continued breaking down his financial crimes with clinical precision. I said, "You used the capital you siphoned from my family trust to create a phantom workforce. I saw the encrypted bank transfers. You set up dozens of shell accounts disguised as independent contractors and funneled the money right back into your own pocket to simulate a booming fake payroll. You used those completely fabricated employment records to secure your next massive round of funding. That is not just a little white lie to save a struggling startup. That is the exact textbook definition of wire fraud. Every single email you sent to your investors containing those fake payroll numbers constitutes a separate federal count. Serena let out a sharp, piercing wail. She turned violently toward her husband, grabbing his expensive suit jacket and shaking him. She screamed, demanding to know if what I was saying was true, demanding to know if the money funding their lavish lifestyle was entirely stolen. Jamal could not even look his wife in the eye. He just stared blankly at the red federal seal on the folder sitting in the center of the table, like it was a loaded gun pointed directly at his chest. Sensing the walls closing in, Harrison desperately tried to salvage his crumbling authority. He stood up, puffing out his chest, though his broad shoulders were visibly shaking under his tailored suit. He pointed a trembling finger at Jamal and attempted to throw his favorite son-in-law entirely under the bus. He declared in a booming voice that he had absolutely no knowledge of Jamal's operational mechanics or fake payroll schemes. He swore that the family trust had only provided a standard business loan in good faith. He announced that he would personally assist the federal authorities in prosecuting Jamal to the fullest extent of the law in order to protect the spotless reputation of the family name. I turned my attention to my father, letting a cold, sharp laugh escape my lips. I told him he could stop performing right now because there was absolutely no one left in this room for him to impress. I said, "You are not an innocent victim, Harrison. You are the primary architect of this entire criminal ecosystem. You happily gave Jamal limitless access to the generational trust because you desperately needed him to generate phantom business losses to offset your own massive unreported capital gains." I walked slowly around the edge of the conference table, pacing deliberately behind my parents' chairs. The air conditioning hummed in the heavy silence broken only by my mother's quiet, hyperventilating sobs. I spoke directly over her panic, ensuring they both heard their impending doom. I told them, "Let us talk about the majestic summer yacht you purchased last year. The massive luxury vessel you proudly paraded across the Hamptons and plastered all over high society social media pages. You confidently told all your wealthy country club friends it was a well-deserved reward for a record-breaking fiscal quarter. But I read the actual unredacted tax filings." Harrison swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. I continued, stepping right into his line of sight. "I said you did not buy that vessel with your personal income. You established a fraudulent offshore entity, registered it as a philanthropic maritime research foundation, and used the generational family trust to purchase the yacht as a tax-exempt corporate asset. You then brazenly wrote off the routine maintenance, the exorbitant docking fees, and the private crew salaries as charitable expenses. You committed textbook federal tax evasion to buy a luxury boat, and you used my grandmother's hard-earned legacy to facilitate the crime." Patricia buried her face in her hands, her heavy diamond rings digging into her perfectly manicured skin. She began to rock back and forth in her chair, muttering frantically that she would not survive a day in a federal prison. She cried that she could not handle the public disgrace and that her entire social life was permanently ruined. She looked up at me, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, jagged lines, begging me to call the investigators and withdraw the files. She pleaded that I was her own daughter, that blood was supposed to mean something to me. I stopped pacing and stood perfectly still at the head of the table. I looked down at her with absolute emotional detachment. I told her blood only mattered to this family when it could be successfully monetized or violently manipulated. I reminded her that less than 20 minutes ago she had called me a stubborn, ungrateful brat and demanded I sign away my entire financial independence to protect her stolen wealth. "You do not get to invoke the sanctity of family loyalty now that you are staring down the barrel of a federal indictment," I said. The room was entirely stripped of the arrogant, victorious atmosphere they had brought into it. They were four broken, terrified people who had finally hit a wall they could neither bribe nor bully their way through. I walked back to my seat next to Mitchell. I reached across the table and picked up the extortion demand Richard Vance had left behind in his panicked haste. The very document they had proudly tried to use to force my total submission. I held it up so they could clearly see the ridiculous demands and the highly aggressive, threatening legal language. I tossed the extortion letter onto the polished mahogany table, letting it land right next to the federal whistleblower file. I looked straight into Harrison's terrified eyes and delivered the final absolute blow. I asked, "Did your high-priced shark lawyer happen to mention how many years in federal prison you get for actively attempting to extort a protected witness who is fully cooperating with the IRS and the FBI?" The word extortion hung in the stifling air of the conference room. It was the final nail in their collective coffin. The unified front they had maintained for 30 years fractured and dissolved right before my eyes. The arrogant syndicate of the family was entirely dead, replaced instantly by 4 desperate, terrified individuals willing to do absolutely anything to save themselves. Jamal was the first to break. The sheer primal panic of facing decades behind bars stripped away his polished tech executive persona. He scrambled backward out of his chair, knocking it over with a loud crash. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my father. His voice cracked, pitching an octave higher, as his fundamental self-preservation instincts completely overrode his marital loyalty. He yelled that he had absolutely nothing to do with the overarching tax evasion scheme. He screamed that Harrison was the one pulling the strings the entire time. Jamal claimed he only created the fake payroll accounts because Harrison had cornered him in a private meeting and explicitly threatened to publicly bankrupt his startup if Jamal refused to cooperate. He practically choked on his own words as he told everyone that Harrison needed a secure pipeline to wash the dirty real estate money and forced him to be the financial mule. He sobbed that he was just following the strict orders of the family patriarch, terrified of losing his massive angel investments. Harrison's face turned a violent mottled shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched white collar. He slammed both of his heavy fists onto the mahogany table, sending shockwaves through the solid wood. He roared at Jamal, calling him a pathetic, incompetent parasite. He bellowed that Jamal had driven his own company into the ground with idiotic bets and amateur management. Harrison screamed that Jamal came crawling to him begging for a bailout on his hands and knees just to hide his catastrophic financial failures from the Silicon Valley investors. Serena sat frozen for exactly 5 seconds, her brain struggling to process the rapid-fire confessions bouncing across the room. Her eyes darted wildly between her father and her husband. The realization hit her with the force of a speeding freight train. She realized Jamal had been lying to her every single night. He had sworn the startup was preparing for a massive public offering. He had encouraged her to keep spending the trust money, assuring her he would easily replace it with his upcoming tech dividends. Serena stood up, her chair screeching harshly against the floor. She marched directly over to her husband. Jamal turned toward her, lifting his hands in a weak, defensive gesture, opening his mouth to formulate another pathetic excuse. He never got the chance. Serena raised her hand and delivered a vicious, open-palmed slap directly across his face. The sharp crack of flesh hitting flesh echoed like a gunshot in the sterile conference room. Jamal stumbled backward, clutching his rapidly reddening cheek, his eyes wide with absolute shock. Serena did not stop there. She lunged at him again, grabbing the lapels of his custom Italian suit and shaking him violently. She shrieked that he was a disgusting liar and a complete fraud. She screamed that he had ruined her entire life, her pristine reputation, and her flawless future because he was too much of a coward to admit his business was a colossal failure. Jamal shoved her hands away, his own anger finally boiling over the edge of his panic. He yelled right back into her face, telling her to stop playing the innocent victim. He reminded her maliciously that she was the exact person who forged the charitable foundation documents to secure her luxury Hamptons rentals. He screamed that she was the one who actively drained the trust funds to buy designer clothes and fund her extravagant socialite lifestyle while willingly committing federal tax evasion. They stood inches apart, screaming horrible, venomous accusations at each other. They were tearing each other apart, desperately trying to shift the blame, providing me with an absolute symphony of verbal confessions. Every single word they screamed confirmed the exact details I had outlined in my federal whistleblower report. Harrison tried to regain control of the room, shouting at the top of his lungs, demanding silence, commanding them to sit down and form a unified legal strategy. But his voice lacked its usual terrifying authority. He was just a panicked old man yelling over a ruined family. His empire of fraud had officially collapsed, and he was utterly powerless to stop the bleeding. I sat perfectly still beside Mitchell, watching the chaotic scene unfold with cold, absolute detachment. I did not interrupt them, I let them destroy each other. Patricia watched the horrifying spectacle with wide, unblinking eyes. She watched her husband facing federal indictment. She watched her golden child and her favorite son-in-law physically fighting and screaming about felony charges. The grand illusion of her superior aristocratic family was permanently shattered. There was no country club gala or expensive public relations firm that could possibly fix this catastrophe. The reality of the federal seal sitting on the table finally penetrated her deep-seated, lifelong denial. Her legs seemed to give out completely. The matriarch of the family, known for her impeccable posture and terrifying social dominance, physically collapsed. She slipped down from her expensive leather chair, her designer dress pooling heavily around her on the hardwood floor. Patricia crawled the short distance across the floor toward my chair. It was the most pathetic display of cowardice I had ever witnessed. She reached out with trembling hands and grabbed my wrist. Her fingers were ice cold and shaking violently. She looked up at me, her face completely ruined by rivers of black mascara and endless tears. She fell entirely to her knees, clutching my hand tightly against her chest. She sobbed uncontrollably, her chest heaving with desperate, gasping breaths. She looked deeply into my eyes, deploying the absolute last weapon she had left in her emotional arsenal, the weapon of maternal guilt. "Naomi, please," she wailed, her voice breaking into a pathetic whimper. "I beg of you, flesh and blood, Naomi. You cannot do this to us. We are your family. We are your flesh and blood. You grew up in our home. You cannot turn around and send your own parents to a federal prison. Please, Naomi, have some mercy on your own mother." I stared down at the woman kneeling on the floor. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I looked at the hands clutching mine, and I remembered every single time those same hands had pushed me away. I remembered every time she had chosen to protect Serena's lies over my absolute truth. I remembered every time she had looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust, because I refused to conform to her toxic, superficial standards. I slowly and deliberately pulled my wrist out of her desperate grip. I did not do it aggressively. I did it with a calm, terrifying finality. I let my arm rest on the arm of my chair, putting a distinct physical distance between us. I looked down at Patricia, making sure she saw the absolute void in my eyes. I wanted her to see that the daughter she had spent 30 years trying to break had finally evolved into something completely unbreakable. The tears streaming down her face held absolutely no currency in my world anymore. Patricia slumped back onto the polished mahogany floor. Her hands fell limply to her sides. She stared up at me with vacant, bloodshot eyes, finally understanding that the emotional manipulation she had relied on for 3 decades had completely lost its power. The hysterical sobbing abruptly stopped, replaced by a shallow, terrified hyperventilation. She looked tiny and pathetic, sitting in a puddle of her own expensive silk dress. I did not offer her a hand up. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply turned my attention away from her and looked back at Harrison. He was still frozen in his seat, watching his wife grovel on the floor. The legendary Wall Street titan had been reduced to a paralyzed spectator in his own destruction. I reached down into my leather briefcase one final time. The room grew impossibly quiet. Even Jamal and Serena stopped their vicious bickering to watch my movements. They were terrified of what else I could possibly produce. I pulled out a second folder. This one was thinner than the massive whistleblower report sitting on the table, but the bright yellow classified sticker on the cover made Harrison flinch. I dropped it onto the wood surface next to the first file. The sharp slap of the heavy cardstock echoed in the dead air. I placed my hand flat on top of the yellow folder. I told them the first file I submitted to the federal investigators covers the structural mechanics of your systemic tax evasion and wire fraud. It provides the IRS and the FBI with the exact paper trail of your offshore accounts and fake payroll schemes. It is more than enough to trigger immediate raids, asset seizures, and massive federal indictments. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice measured and perfectly even. I said, however, that first file leaves a tiny margin of error for your high-priced defense attorneys. It leaves a microscopic window for you to claim accounting incompetence or blame rogue financial managers. It leaves room for a potential plea deal. This second file, on the other hand, eliminates all of that entirely. I tapped the yellow folder with my index finger. I told them this supplementary file contains over 400 pages of internal personal communications. It holds the direct, unredacted emails between Harrison and his offshore fixers, explicitly discussing how to hide the yacht purchases from IRS auditors. It contains the encrypted text messages between Serena and Jamal, coordinating the exact amounts to drain from the trust for their personal luxury expenses. It proves absolute malicious criminal intent and undeniable premeditation. I looked at my father and let the terrifying reality sink deep into his bones. I said, if I hand this supplementary file to the Department of Justice, you will not get a plea deal. You will get the absolute mandatory maximum sentence. You will die in a federal penitentiary, Harrison. A heavy, suffocating dread blanketed the conference room. Harrison opened his mouth to speak, but his jaw just trembled. Patricia let out a strangled gasp from the floor, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. I ignored her completely. I told them the initial whistleblower report is already filed and completely out of my hands. But I have not yet submitted this supplementary evidence. I will lock this yellow folder in a secure vault and withhold the proof of premeditated criminal intent on exactly 2 conditions. Mitchell anticipated my cue perfectly. My attorney unzipped his own briefcase and pulled out a crisp stack of freshly printed legal documents. He slid them smoothly across the polished table until they rested directly in front of Harrison. I did not look at the papers. I kept my eyes locked on my father. I told him condition number 1 is absolute and non-negotiable. You and Patricia are going to sign a binding, irrevocable renunciation of the generational family trust. You are going to sign away 100% of your rights, your interests, and your access to the accounts. You will immediately step down as trustees and forfeit any legal claim to the assets, the properties, and the liquid capital. You will never see another single dime of my grandmother's money as long as you live. Harrison stared at the legal documents like they were covered in venom. His face twisted in a mixture of profound outrage and absolute terror. Signing those papers meant surrendering his entire empire. It meant losing the primary source of his immense wealth and unearned power. He looked up at me, his gray eyes wide with desperate anger. He accused me of stealing his legacy. He stammered that I was leaving them with nothing but their heavily mortgaged properties and failing corporate accounts. He said I was effectively bankrupting them. I did not blink. I told him, I am not stealing anything, Harrison. I am simply taking back the legacy you spent the last decade using as a criminal slush fund. I am protecting my grandmother's life work from being seized by federal agents to pay off your massive tax penalties. You built a house of cards on top of stolen money, and now the wind is blowing. You can either sign away the trust and spend the rest of your life figuring out how to live on a strict budget, or you can refuse to sign, and I will hand this yellow folder to the federal prosecutor before lunchtime. You can choose bankruptcy, or you can choose a concrete sell. I do not care which one you pick. Patricia scrambled up from the floor. Her knees knocked against the heavy table as she grabbed Harrison's arm. Her manicured nails dug into his expensive suit jacket. She was weeping hysterically, shaking him and screaming at him to sign the papers immediately. She shrieked that they could not go to prison under any circumstances. She yelled that they would lose everything anyway if the federal government brought down the full weight of a premeditated fraud conviction. She begged him to just give me the trust so they could stay out of jail. Harrison looked at his hysterical wife and then looked at the yellow folder. The fierce, arrogant patriarch who had ruled our family through fear and financial manipulation was completely gone. He reached out with a trembling hand and picked up the silver fountain pen that Richard Vance had left behind. His fingers were shaking so violently he could barely grip the metal barrel. He pulled the thick stack of renunciation documents toward him. The room was dead silent, except for the heavy, ragged sound of his breathing. He pressed the pen to the paper. The sharp, scratching sound of the nib cutting across the signature line echoed against the glass walls. He signed the first page. He flipped it and signed the second. He turned to the final page and signed his name one last time, officially terminating his reign over the family empire. He dropped the pen. It clattered against the table, rolling to a stop. He pushed the documents toward Patricia. She snatched the pen and scribbled her own name with frantic, desperate speed tears splashing onto the crisp white paper. They slid the signed contracts back across the table. They had surrendered everything. I picked up the signed renunciation contracts, smoothing the slightly crumpled edges where my mother had gripped them too tightly. I checked the signatures, verifying the frantic, jagged ink strokes belonging to my parents. I handed the pages directly to Mitchell, who silently verified their legal binding before sliding them into a heavy leather folder. The generational trust was officially completely out of their hands. The financial weapon they had used to control, manipulate, and belittle me for decades was now safely deactivated. I told them that was step one. The heavy, suffocating silence returned immediately, as they realized the full scope of my mercy had not yet been reached. I turned my focus away from the broken patriarch and the weeping matriarch on the floor. I locked my eyes directly onto Jamal. He physically flinched under my gaze, sinking deeper into the expensive leather chair he had swaggered into just an hour ago. He looked exactly like a cornered animal, waiting for the final deadly strike. I reached into my briefcase one last time. I pulled out a single crisp document bound in a blue legal backing and slid it smoothly across the polished mahogany wood. It stopped exactly an inch from his trembling fingertips. I kept my voice entirely void of emotion. I told him my second condition required his absolute and immediate cooperation. I demanded that he sign the asset purchase agreement currently resting in front of him. I instructed him to transfer 100% of his startup equity, including every single patent software codebase and piece of intellectual property, directly over to my private venture capital fund. I told him the total purchase price for his entire corporate existence was exactly $1. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out a crisp $1 bill, and placed it deliberately on top of the signature line. Serena completely lost what little composure she had left. Her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion and rage. She slammed both of her hands flat onto the table and leaned aggressively toward me. She screamed at the top of her lungs, asking if I was completely out of my mind. Her voice was shrill and desperate, echoing harshly against the frosted glass walls of the conference room. She yelled, asking why in the world I would want to acquire a bankrupt, fraudulent startup that was bleeding cash, drowning in fake payroll liabilities, and currently under federal investigation. She accused me of being purely vindictive just for the sake of humiliation. She shrieked that the company was a toxic asset and completely worthless. I looked at my sister, letting her hysterical voice fade into the background. She was so incredibly short-sighted, always focused on the shiny, expensive exterior, and completely blind to the foundational value underneath. It was the exact same fatal flaw that had blinded my entire family for my whole life. They only valued things they could show off at country club dinners. They lacked the vision to see raw potential. I looked back at Jamal. I told him his wife was actually right about one specific thing. His executive management was an absolute catastrophic failure. He was a terrible CEO who burned through millions of dollars of stolen family money, chasing flashy tech trends, paying for expensive public relations campaigns, and outfitting his useless office with luxury espresso machines while producing zero actual revenue. But I told him his lead developer, the quiet guy he paid peanuts and forced to work 80-hour weeks, had built a proprietary data compression algorithm buried deep inside his incredibly messy codebase. Jamal stared at me, his jaw going slack. He blinked rapidly. He had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. I explained that I had my own forensic tech team quietly analyze his software architecture last month, while he was busy staging fake payroll records to impress his vanity investors. The core algorithm his developer wrote was completely revolutionary for transferring massive encrypted medical files between hospital databases. I told him I already had two major healthcare conglomerates lined up, ready to purchase the exclusive licensing rights for a figure that would make his original angel investors weep with envy. I leaned in closer, watching the devastating realization wash over his face. He had possessed a billion-dollar gold mine the entire time, but he was too busy playing the role of a wealthy tech genius to actually understand his own product. I told him the company was only bankrupt because he was at the helm. Under my strict financial control and with my corporate connections, that intellectual property would yield tens of millions within the very first quarter. I tapped the single-dollar bill resting on the contract. I told him he could either sign his golden goose over to me right now and walk away free from federal wire fraud charges, or he could refuse and try to explain his brilliant business strategy to a federal judge. Jamal looked at the single piece of paper. He looked at the dollar bill, mocking his entire existence. He looked at his ruined father-in-law sitting paralyzed across the table, and his hysterical wife who had just realized she was married to an incompetent fool who threw away a legitimate fortune. He knew he had absolutely no leverage left. The federal seal on the yellow folder glared at him, demanding complete submission. He slowly reached out his hand, shaking uncontrollably, and picked up the silver pen. The heavy polished metal seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds between his clammy fingers. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, tracking a path through the expensive foundation he wore to look good for investor meetings. He hovered the platinum nib just a fraction of an inch above the signature line, staring at the single crumpled dollar bill that now represented his entire professional legacy. Serena grabbed his shoulder, her manicured nails digging violently into his suit jacket. She screamed at him, demanding he drop the pen. She shrieked that he could not possibly sign away their entire future for a single dollar bill. She yelled that there had to be another way out, that they could hire better lawyers, that they could fight the federal government. She was completely unhinged, still desperately clinging to the delusion that her aristocratic privilege could somehow shield her from federal wire fraud charges. Jamal did not even look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the blue legal backing of the asset purchase agreement. He knew exactly what the federal seal on my whistleblower file meant. He knew the FBI already had his encrypted hard drives, his fake contractor invoices, and his offshore wire transfer logs. There was absolutely no high-priced defense attorney on the planet who could save him from the mountain of digital evidence I had meticulously handed over to the Department of Justice. He was completely cornered, and his arrogant tech visionary persona had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I pushed my chair back, letting the legs scrape harshly against the floorboards. I stood up to my full height, smoothing the front of my blazer. The sudden movement commanded the immediate attention of everyone in the room. Even Serena stopped mid-scream, her mouth hanging open as she looked up at me. I walked slowly around the edge of the mahogany table, my heels clicking deliberately against the polished floor, until I was standing directly behind Jamal. I leaned down, placing both of my hands flat on the table on either side of his shoulders, trapping him in his seat. He shrank down into the leather, trying to put as much distance between us as physically possible, but there was nowhere left to run. I looked down at the side of his face, studying his utter devastation. I told him my sister is absolutely right about one thing, Jamal. She asked why I would want to acquire a failing startup that is currently hemorrhaging cash and drowning in federal liabilities. She thinks this is just a vindictive power play to humiliate you. But you and I both know I am a venture capitalist. I do not waste my time or my capital on petty emotional revenge. Every single move I make is strictly business. I let my words hang in the heavy air, ensuring the suffocating silence amplified the incoming blow. I said I am forcing you to sign away this company for a single dollar because the core source code your lead developer created is an absolute masterpiece. I explained that while he was busy flying first class to tech conferences, giving hollow keynote speeches, and posing for magazine covers, his underpaid, overworked engineering team had accidentally solved a massive data compression bottleneck. The algorithm buried beneath his terrible management structure was the exact missing piece of architecture my investment fund needed for a massive upcoming corporate merger. Jamal stopped breathing entirely. His grip on the silver pen tightened until his knuckles turned completely white. I leaned in even closer, lowering my voice until it was a lethal whisper directly in his ear. I said you were sitting on an absolute goldmine, Jamal. But you were entirely too stupid and far too obsessed with your own vanity to know how to commercialize it. You spent millions of dollars of my family trust money trying to look like a genius, while completely ignoring the actual genius sitting right in your own server room. I paused, letting the agonizing reality wash over him. I told him my fund is integrating your source code into a massive healthcare technology buyout next week. The initial baseline valuation for that proprietary algorithm is a minimum of $50 million. It will likely double by the fourth quarter. Serena gasped, clutching her throat. Her eyes bulged as the number echoed through the room. $50 million. She repeated the amount in a breathless whisper, her mind visibly snapping under the weight of the lost fortune. She stared at Jamal, not with anger anymore, but with a profound, sickening disgust. She realized her husband had not just dragged her into a federal tax evasion conspiracy, but he had completely fumbled a legitimate empire in the process. The lavish lifestyle, the private jets, the endless shopping sprees, all of it had been sitting right there legally, and he was too incompetent to secure it. You could have been a legitimate titan, Jamal. I continued, keeping my focus entirely on his crumbling form. You could have had the wealth and the respect you so desperately craved. But you chose to be a fraud instead. So thank you for the generous gift, brother-in-law. I will make sure your developer gets the executive promotion and the equity share he actually deserves once I take over your company. A choked, pathetic sound escaped Jamal's throat. It was a cross between a sob and a gasp for air. The absolute magnitude of his failure crushed him flat. He was not just losing his freedom if he refused to sign. He was acknowledging that he had voluntarily thrown away $50 million because of his own blinding incompetence. He had destroyed his reputation, alienated his investors, committed federal felonies, and ruined his marriage for absolutely nothing. He had been completely outplayed, outsmarted, and outmaneuvered by the very sister-in-law he had spent years mocking at family dinners. The realization that I was the actual shark in the water, while he was just a flashy guppy, broke his mind completely. Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, tears of absolute humiliation leaking out from beneath his eyelashes. He pressed the silver pen to the paper. His hand was shaking so badly he could barely form the letters of his own name. He dragged the ink across the signature line, scrawling his signature beneath the $1 bill. He did not hesitate when he reached the intellectual property transfer addendum. He signed away the patents. He signed away the software rights. He signed away the server access codes. Every stroke of the pen legally transferred tens of millions of dollars of value directly into my personal holding company. When he was finished, he dropped the pen onto the table as if the metal had suddenly burned his skin. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the cool mahogany wood, burying his face in his arms. He wept openly, a broken, defeated shell of a man, entirely stripped of his pride, his company, and his future. I reached over his trembling shoulders and pulled the signed asset purchase agreement away from him. I picked up the crisp $1 bill and placed it gently against the back of his expensive suit jacket. I told him he could keep the change. I walked out of the mediation room, leaving the dollar bill resting on Jamal's trembling back. Mitchell followed closely behind me, his briefcase heavy with the signed documents that officially dismantled 30 years of my family's financial tyranny. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind us, cutting off the sounds of Serena's hysterical sobbing and Harrison's shallow, hyperventilating breaths. The air in the hallway felt remarkably crisp and clean. The legal machinery I had set in motion over the past 6 months did not wait for them to catch their breath. The moment Mitchell officially filed the irrevocable renunciation documents and the asset purchase agreement, the final dominoes began to violently crash down. The phantom wealth they had relied on to fuel their arrogant existence evaporated into thin air almost overnight. Serena found out first. Less than 48 hours after our meeting, she received a humiliating phone call from the premier luxury real estate broker in East Hampton. The massive $200,000 security deposit she had proudly put down for their sprawling summer beachfront estate had bounced. The fraudulent philanthropic trust account she routinely used to pay for her extravagant vacations had been officially frozen by federal regulators. The broker did not just cancel the lease, he permanently blacklisted her from the agency. Serena threw a massive tantrum demanding to speak to the owner, but she was abruptly hung up on. The elite summer playground she used to dominate was completely closed off to her. She would not be hosting any celebrity clam bakes or posting sunset cocktail photos from a private deck this season. Her $200,000 was completely gone, seized by the IRS to cover the preliminary fraud penalties. The humiliation compounded rapidly. The whispers of the impending federal tax evasion investigation leaked into the high society rumor mill and quickly reached the corporate sponsors funding Serena's lifestyle influencer empire. Brands are notoriously allergic to federal fraud. The fallout was instantaneous and absolute. By Friday morning, her inbox was flooded with termination notices. The luxury skincare line that paid her $20,000 a post immediately severed their contract, citing a strict breach of their morality clause. The designer athletic wear company pulled her upcoming campaign and demanded she return the promotional merchandise. Her boutique management agency dropped her as a client, entirely refusing to return her frantic phone calls. Serena watched her meticulously curated digital identity crumble in real time. The sycophantic followers who used to praise her every move suddenly turned vicious. Her comment sections were flooded with mockery regarding her husband's fake tech company and her family's impending criminal charges. She was forced to deactivate her accounts, retreating into a dark, silent digital exile. Harrison tried desperately to pretend the sky was not falling. He put on his tailored golf attire and drove his imported luxury sedan to his exclusive country club, hoping to find refuge among his fellow Wall Street titans. He needed to prove he was still a man of immense influence. He walked into the clubhouse expecting the usual deferential greetings from the staff and respectful nods from the members. Instead, he was met with a deafening, uncomfortable silence. The club manager, a man who had polished Harrison's golf clubs and poured his scotch for 15 years, intercepted him before he could even reach the dining room. The manager handed him a sealed envelope holding a formal letter from the board of directors. His membership had been immediately and permanently revoked. The elite circle he had spent his entire life cultivating had violently rejected him the exact moment the scent of a federal indictment touched his suit. They did not want federal agents knocking on the clubhouse doors. He was escorted off the manicured grounds by private security, while his former friends watched with undisguised contempt. But the absolute killing blow arrived at the end of the month. Without Jamal's fake payroll scheme generating phantom income and without access to my grandmother's generational trust, they had absolutely no liquid capital to sustain their massive monthly overhead. The mortgage on their sprawling 10,000-square-foot primary residence was exorbitant. They missed the first payment. Then they missed the second. The bank holding the note was not interested in their previous social status or their aristocratic lineage. The foreclosure notices arrived via certified mail, plastered directly onto their custom mahogany front doors for all their wealthy neighbors to see. They had to pack. The grand illusion was officially over. I drove past their neighborhood on the final day of their eviction. I parked my car a block away, watching the pathetic scene unfold from a safe distance. There were no professional white-glove moving services handling their transition. They simply could not afford them. Instead, I watched Harrison in a wrinkled button-down shirt struggling to load cheap cardboard boxes into the back of a rented moving truck. His face was gray, his posture completely defeated. He looked like a frail old man, broken by the weight of his own hubris. Patricia stood on the dying manicured lawn, clutching a single designer handbag, crying silently as she watched her expensive imported furniture being carelessly shoved into the cargo bay. She was wearing sweatpants and a faded sweater, looking entirely unrecognizable from the terrifying matriarch who used to dictate my every flaw. Jamal and Serena were moving into a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a dismal suburb, completely devoid of the luxury they felt inherently entitled to. Serena was shouting at Jamal in the driveway, blaming him for dropping a box of her expensive shoes into a puddle. Jamal just ignored her, his eyes hollow and empty, still mourning the $50 million tech fortune he had blindly signed away to me. They were completely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their toxic power. They were finally forced to exist in the miserable reality they had created for themselves. I sat in the driver's seat of my car, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace. I had not destroyed my family. I had simply stopped protecting them from their own destructive nature. The empire of lies was reduced to a pile of cheap cardboard boxes sitting on a rented truck. I put my car in drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving them behind forever. The drive back to my estate was a quiet blur of rain-slicked streets and the rhythmic swish of my windshield wipers. The sky had opened up shortly after I left my family to their miserable moving day, pouring buckets of freezing gray water over the city. I turned onto my private road, the heavy iron gates of my property coming into view through the gloom. As my headlights swept across the slick pavement, they illuminated a solitary figure standing completely exposed to the elements. I slowed my car to a halt, the engine idling with a low hum. It was Jamal. He was standing outside my security gate without a coat or an umbrella. The freezing rain plastered his thin shirt to his chest, and his dark hair was matted flat against his skull. He looked exactly like a stray dog that had been kicked out into an alleyway. This was the man who just weeks ago wore custom Italian suits and bragged about disrupting the global tech industry while sipping $3,000 champagne at our family dinners. This was the man who used to swirl his expensive cognac and laugh loudly whenever my mother belittled my career choices. Now he was shivering uncontrollably, his ruined leather shoes sinking into the mud at the edge of my driveway. I hit the button to roll down my tinted window just a few inches, letting the cold, damp air rush into the heated leather interior of my car. I did not unlock the gate. I simply stared at him, forcing him to walk through the puddles to reach my window. He shuffled forward, his shoulders hunched, his teeth audibly chattering. He gripped the edge of my car door, wrapping his freezing pale fingers over the wet glass. He called my name, his voice cracking pathetically over the sound of the pouring rain. He begged me for 5 minutes of my time. He said he had walked 2 miles from the nearest bus stop because he could no longer afford a rideshare, and Serena had taken their only remaining car to visit a divorce attorney. He looked incredibly small, stripped of his arrogant bravado and his phantom wealth. I kept my hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, staring at him with absolute indifference. I asked him what he could possibly want from me now that I already owned his entire corporate existence. Jamal swallowed hard rainwater dripping from his chin onto his ruined collar. He told me he was completely out of options. He said the federal investigators had frozen every single account tied to his name. The massive legal retainer he needed to keep himself out of federal prison was completely out of reach. Serena was screaming at him day and night, blaming him for her public humiliation and the loss of her luxury sponsorships. He looked down at the muddy pavement, throwing away the last microscopic shred of his dignity. He begged me for a job. I raised an eyebrow, letting the sheer absurdity of his request hang in the frigid air. The man who had mocked my business acumen, who had proudly participated in my financial excommunication, was now shivering in my driveway, begging for a paycheck from my venture capital fund. I asked him exactly what kind of position he thought he was qualified for in my organization. I reminded him that I ran a ruthless, highly profitable corporate entity, not a charity for incompetent frauds. He quickly shook his head, water flying from his wet hair. He said he did not expect an executive role. He was not asking to be a vice president or a director. He pleaded with me to let him back into his former company as a simple project manager. He promised he would work 90-hour weeks. He swore he would report directly to the lead developer he used to mistreat. He frantically claimed that he still had some foundational knowledge of the software architecture and could help smooth over the transition process during the upcoming corporate merger. He promised he would stay out of sight work in a dark cubicle and never question my authority ever again. I looked at his desperate, bloodshot eyes. I let a cold, sharp laugh escape my lips. The sound cut right through the heavy rain. I told him his delusion was actually fascinating. I explained that he had absolutely zero technical skills. He was a charismatic fraud who memorized a few Silicon Valley buzzwords to swindle naive angel investors. I reminded him that my forensic tech team had already mapped out the entire codebase, and the lead developer, the actual genius who built the $50 million algorithm, was now my chief technology officer. I told Jamal that I had actually asked the developer if his former CEO had contributed anything useful to the source code, and the developer had laughed out loud. We did not need a failed executive to manage a project he never understood in the first place. I leaned slightly closer to the window, the rain misting against my cheek. I told him he was a walking massive liability. I asked him why in the world I would ever let a man currently under active investigation for federal wire fraud anywhere near a highly sensitive healthcare technology buyout. The corporate partners would instantly kill the $50 million merger the exact second his name appeared on any payroll ledger. He was toxic waste, and letting him scrub the toilets in my corporate lobby would be a massive financial risk to my shareholders. Jamal let out a pathetic whimpering sound, his knees visibly buckling as the reality of his utter uselessness crashed down on him. He gripped my window tighter, leaving muddy fingerprints on the glass. He sobbed openly, the tears mixing with the rain on his face. He pleaded that he had a family, that he was going to lose his wife, that he was terrified of going to federal prison without a high-priced defense team. He begged me to show him just a fraction of mercy. He said I had already won, and he was completely destroyed, so there was no need to keep punishing him. I looked at the broken man weeping in the storm. I told him this was never about punishment. It was about consequence. For over a decade, he had happily profited off my exclusion and my humiliation. He had enabled my parents and cheered as they tried to crush my independence. He had gladly spent stolen family trust money to fund his fake lifestyle while telling me I was a disappointment. I told him mercy was a privilege reserved for people who possessed basic human decency, and he had proven time and time again that he possessed none. I reached out and pressed the button to roll the window up. Jamal pulled his hands back just in time, stumbling backward into a deep, muddy puddle. I looked him dead in the eye through the water-slicked glass. I told him to walk home. I put my foot on the accelerator, and the heavy iron gates slowly swung open. I drove my car up the pristine, manicured driveway, leaving the former tech visionary standing alone in the freezing rain to face the exact miserable future he had built for himself. I watched him shrink in my rearview mirror for only a second before a sudden frantic movement caught my eye. Jamal was not giving up. He lunged forward, slipping through the narrow gap of the heavy iron gates, just a fraction of a second before the electronic mechanism locked them shut. He began sprinting up my long, winding driveway, chasing my taillights through the blinding downpour. He slipped on the wet asphalt, scraping his knees and tearing his expensive trousers, but he scrambled right back up. He was running on pure, unadulterated panic. I did not speed up. I maintained a steady, calm pace, allowing him to exhaust himself completely as he trailed hopelessly behind my car. By the time I pulled under the massive illuminated portico framing my front entrance, he was gasping for air, his chest heaving violently. I parked and stepped out of my vehicle onto the dry, heated stone of my entryway. Jamal collapsed at the bottom of my front steps, falling entirely to his knees. The freezing rain washed the mud and blood from his torn trousers down onto my pristine driveway. He looked up at me, his face a mask of absolute desperation. He begged me to listen. He threw his hands out, claiming he would do anything to prove his loyalty to my new corporate structure. He violently threw his own wife under the bus, offering to testify against Serena and Harrison in federal court. He sobbed, telling me he had secret records of their offshore accounts that the FBI did not even know about yet. He said he would hand over everything, his own family and his father-in-law, if I just gave him a tiny consulting role to shield him from complete bankruptcy. The sheer cowardice of his offer was staggering. He was willing to sell out the very people whose aristocratic coattails he had ridden for a decade, just to save his own skin. I looked down at him, feeling nothing but profound disgust. I remembered the arrogant smirk on his face the day they abandoned me. I remembered the way he had laughed when Serena told me I was a social liability. I walked to the top of my front steps, looking down at him as if he were an insect. I told him he was fundamentally broken. I explained that his betrayal of his own wife did not make him valuable to my company. It just proved he was a parasite willing to latch on to whatever host could keep him alive. I watched the freezing rain soak through his thin shirt, making him shiver violently. I asked him if he remembered our family winter trip to Aspen 5 years ago. I saw a flicker of panicked confusion cross his wet face. I reminded him of the freezing snowstorm the day the family decided to leave the luxury cabin a day early. I reminded him how I had quickly packed my bags and stood on the icy driveway waiting to load my luggage into the rented luxury SUV. I recounted exactly how Serena had looked at me from the warm leather interior of that car, while he sat comfortably in the passenger seat scrolling through his phone, completely ignoring my existence. I told him I remembered my mother claiming the car was too full of their designer luggage to fit me. I remembered Serena laughing and telling me to figure it out myself, because my presence would ruin their aesthetic road trip photos. They had left me stranded on a mountain in a blizzard without a second thought, because my existence was an inconvenience to their perfect family illusion. They had driven away in the warmth, leaving me to freeze. And now the universe had flawlessly reversed our positions. I looked at Jamal, my voice as cold as ice. I told him my company does not have enough space for you. I paused, letting the crushing weight of the rejection paralyze him. I said it is exactly like how your family did not have enough space for me on that car leaving Aspen. I looked at his muddy, ruined shoes. I told him to try calling an Uber, or better yet, try finding a real job. I did not wait for his pathetic response. I turned on my heel, walked through the grand double doors of my estate, and slammed them shut behind me. The heavy wood and thick reinforced glass instantly silenced his wailing, sealing him out in the cold where he belonged. The silence inside my home was beautiful. I walked into my living room, shedding my damp coat. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Through the tinted glass, I could see Jamal slowly picking himself up from the driveway. He looked around wildly, realizing the gates were locked behind him, and my front door was impenetrable. He had to begin the long, humiliating walk back down the driveway and out into the stormy streets entirely on foot with absolutely nothing to his name. The next morning, the financial news networks were completely dominated by the story. The Department of Justice officially unsealed the indictments. My television screen flashed vivid images of Harrison being escorted from his temporary, dismal rental apartment in handcuffs. The news anchor detailed the total collapse of Serena's influencer brand and the massive wire fraud perpetrated by Jamal's empty shell of a startup. The media ruthlessly dismantled their aristocratic facade, exposing them to the world as nothing more than greedy, desperate con artists. I sat on my plush sofa taking a slow sip of my coffee. I had reclaimed my stolen inheritance, multiplied it exponentially, and systematically dismantled the toxic structure that had tried to bury me. I had not just survived their cruelty, I had weaponized their own arrogance to build an empire. The family that once cast me out as a worthless outsider was now entirely bankrupt, facing federal prison and stripped of their precious social standing. Meanwhile, my company was finalizing a massive $50 million merger, my wealth was compounding daily, and my life was completely my own. I looked at the bright morning sun clearing the rain clouds outside my window and smiled. The storm was finally over, and I was the only one left standing. Exactly 1 year later, the bright morning sun reflected off a very different kind of view. The suffocating skyline of the city had been replaced by the sweeping, endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. I wrapped my heavy cashmere shawl tighter around my shoulders, letting the crisp salt-laced December wind rush past my face. It was Christmas morning. The massive wraparound mahogany balcony I was currently standing on belonged to a sprawling oceanfront estate in East Hampton. It was an absolute masterpiece of modern coastal architecture, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls, imported Italian marble floors, and a private heated infinity pool that spilled visually out toward the crashing waves of the private beach. It was a property designed specifically for the apex predators of the financial world to showcase their absolute dominance. It was also the exact same property Serena had cried over when her fraudulent trust account was frozen. When her $200,000 security deposit bounced, the eccentric owner of the estate was left scrambling. He had turned away several other highly lucrative summer rentals to accommodate my sister and her arrogant demands. He was absolutely furious about being burned by a disgraced socialite whose family was suddenly splashing across the front pages of federal indictment reports. My private real estate broker knew I was actively looking for a primary weekend residence to celebrate my recent corporate milestones. He approached the furious owner with a clean all-cash offer pulled directly from my personal accounts. Because the owner was desperate to offload the property immediately and eager to completely sever any lingering connection to my ruined family, he accepted my bid without a second of hesitation. I purchased Serena's ultimate unattainable dream house at a staggering 20% discount. Every single time I walked through the grand double-height foyer or ran my hand along the custom sweeping staircase, I was reminded of the exquisite poetic justice that bought it. I had used the exact money they tried to steal from me to purchase the exact luxury they lost. The physical opulence surrounding me was simply a reflection of the invisible empire I had solidified over the past 12 months. The healthcare technology buyout had been an unprecedented, historic triumph. The data compression algorithm we salvaged from the wreckage of Jamal's sinking ship integrated flawlessly into the global hospital database network. Within the first 2 quarters, the valuation of that single piece of intellectual property skyrocketed way past our initial $50 million projection. It completely revolutionized encrypted medical file transfers exactly as my forensic tech team had predicted. Because I had personally orchestrated the acquisition, engineered the hostile takeover, and delivered a historic record-breaking return on investment to our shareholders, my position at the venture capital fund was permanently elevated. I was no longer just a senior director managing a mid-level portfolio. I was officially voted in as a full managing partner. I now held a massive equity stake in the entire firm, commanding a global portfolio worth billions of dollars. My name was engraved in bold letters on the frosted glass doors of the executive boardroom. My industry peers spoke of my strategic ruthlessness with a mixture of fear and profound respect. I was no longer someone who needed a seat at the table. I owned the entire room. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the freezing ocean air, thinking about the sharp contrast of this holiday compared to the miserable decades I had spent seeking basic validation in my parents' cold, suffocating house. I remembered the stiff, formal holiday dinners where I was treated like an invisible ghost. I remembered watching silently while my siblings were showered with unearned praise and exorbitant gifts funded by stolen money. I remembered the crushing weight of my mother's constant disapproval and my father's transactional conditional affection. They had spent my entire life trying to convince me I was socially unfit and inherently flawed simply because I refused to play their fraudulent games. Today, there was absolutely none of that toxic energy polluting my space. I turned around and looked through the massive glass doors into my expansive, open-concept living room. A towering 12-foot Christmas tree decorated in elegant silver and ice blue glass ornaments dominated the center of the room. A warm fire crackled loudly in the massive floor-to-ceiling stone hearth, casting a beautiful golden glow across the imported rugs. But the most beautiful part of the entire scene was the people gathered around the massive marble kitchen island. I was hosting my own chosen family. Mitchell, my brilliant corporate attorney, was pouring expensive vintage mimosas and laughing brightly. The quiet lead developer from Jamal's ruined startup, who was now the incredibly wealthy and highly respected chief technology officer of my new subsidiary, was sharing a joyful story with his pregnant wife. My closest friends and loyal colleagues filled the house with genuine warmth and unpretentious joy. There were no fake smiles plastered on for the sake of appearances. There were no passive-aggressive insults disguised as helpful advice. There were no desperate, exhausting attempts to impress anyone. We were simply celebrating our shared success, our mutual respect, and our hard-won peace. I turned my gaze back out to the crashing gray waves of the Atlantic Ocean. I felt completely, permanently unburdened. I had severed the rotting, diseased branches of my family tree and planted myself in rich soil where I could actually thrive. I owned my home free and clear. I owned my career at the absolute highest level. I owned my entire future. The scared, uncertain young woman who used to shrink under the weight of her family's crushing expectations was entirely gone. She had been replaced by a titan who commanded her own destiny. The people who had tried to convince me I was nothing were currently sitting in cramped, dismal apartments, drowning in insurmountable legal debt, and facing years in federal prison. They had gambled their entire generational legacy on the arrogant assumption that I would always be too weak and too compliant to fight back. They had been catastrophically wrong. I raised my coffee mug in a silent, solitary toast to the freezing winter wind. I had taken every ounce of their cruelty, every dismissive insult, and every calculated betrayal and forged it into an unbreakable armor. I was the master of my own universe, standing at the absolute pinnacle of my industry, and the view from the top was nothing short of spectacular. I took one last sip of the rich dark coffee, turned on my heel, and walked back inside to join the people who actually mattered, pulling the heavy glass door shut behind me. The room erupted in joyful cheers and the warm sound of clinking glasses. I took a long, appreciative sip of my wine, letting the warmth spread through my chest. There were no ghosts left to haunt me. There were no toxic family members waiting to tear me down. There was only this beautiful, pristine, perfectly clean victory. The fire crackled brightly, casting a warm, triumphant glow over the room as the scene slowly faded to black.